Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Utopias. This one is super exciting for me. Today, I'm really honored to welcome the famed Greek economist and progressive political leader, Yanis Varoufakis. Some of you may know of Yanis or have seen him in the media or read some of his articles or books. But just to give a little bit of background, starting in January 2015, he was named the Greek Minister of the Treasury. And then he left the government of Greece when he realized that the Greek government that he was part of was cutting deals around austerity, which is basically cutting basic social services and privatizing much of Greece in exchange for some concessions from the European Union. And this was related to the Greek student movement, the Greek debt crisis, which brought him and others into power. And someone of great integrity, he decided to leave the government because of its hypocrisy that he perceived at that time. In 2016, Yanis started the Democracy in Europe movement, DIEM, and he is really one of the most interesting economists and I would say also political thinkers out there. One of definitely the most important and relevant, in my opinion, in Europe. And he really points the finger at how the economy has changed, especially as we look to the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, when former President Barack Obama took office, and how the bailout of the banks and the bailout of the financiers added fuel to the fire around these issues that we're really witnessing today around massive economic inequalities. As he points out, the vast majority of wealth and capital valuation has gone into the hands of very few, and wages have stagnated for the middle and working classes despite massive gains in productivity and including in technological changes. He has one of the most important critiques of big tech platforms, what he calls cloud capital platforms. He calls our experiences with tech platforms and big tech systems a new type of feudalism, or what's called techno-feudalism. This is literally language that Steve Bannon, Trump advisor, former campaign manager, big figure on the right and populist right in the United States and in Europe, has been voicing. So he's literally appropriating the language of Varoufakis to try to fuel a movement that is so different, though it is populist, that is very Trumpian, even though it's at tension with many of the Trump administration's initial decisions to benefit the elites and the economically wealthy. We will see a lot of discussion of what led to the Trump election, where do we go now, where progressive movements can go, and how to sort of find a path forward toward a new sort of utopian vision where this world is more balanced, where people have economic dignity and security. So everybody, please enjoy this conversation. Varoufakis is amazing. Very, very happy and honored to welcome him on the latest episode of Utopias. So I want to start just by engaging you with obviously the, what's right beneath all of our noses. We're just a few weeks after, here in the United States after the election of 2024. And it's said quite far and wide that Trump's election is reflective of the power of his perceived economic populism. So I'm saying that while we see more profound wealth inequality than ever, in the US, 3 people with equivalent wealth to half the population, declining wages, at least in some sort of general sense compared to the accumulation of revenue and profit in the economy, people living paycheck to paycheck, life expectancy even decreasing. And Trump often seems to give voice to people's anger and concerns, but often refers to the economy as the stock market, which you have brilliantly pointed out. Even the stock market is now decoupled from traditional measurements of macroeconomic capitalism, like the GDP. So what gives here? What do you think is going on? And what do we make of the Democratic Party with this mess on our hands?
Donald Trump is a creation of Barack Obama, maybe even before that of Bill Clinton, and certainly of Joe Biden, at least Trump 2.0. In other words, He's not an autonomous political movement, something that sprang out of, if you want, out of the woodwork of American capitalism. He's the product of the failure of Barack Obama, of the fact that Barack Obama in late 2008, which we have to remember was a pivotal moment in world history, in the sense that it was our generation's 1929, in the same way that the world after the fall of 2008 doesn't make sense in terms of what preceded the fall of 2008. Just as, the world after 1929 changed magnificently as a result of Wall Street's collapse. So Barack Obama is elected with Yes, We Can right at that junction. And what was this thing that we can do, according to Barack Obama? Two things. Firstly, look after the victims of financialization, the people whose houses were repossessed, whose lives were wrecked, whose post-1970s false dream that, yes, their wages were stagnant, and they never recovered to the level of 1975 in real terms, but they would get rich because their home, where they invested everything they had, would make them rich. Well, that home value collapsed in 2008. So that dream went. And so Barack Obama wins a landslide on the hope that the many will be looked after. And the very, very few who caused this collapse, this outrageous criminal bubble to inflate and then to burst, will be punished. And what does he do? A few weeks later, in January of 2009, when he gets elected, he appoints Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, the very men who, under Bill Clinton, unleashed the bankers, allowed them to carry out their criminal deeds. He puts them back in the US Treasury with a remit to do two things. Firstly, to impose massive austerity on the majority of the people who had voted for Obama, because the stimulus was a mirage. If you add federal and state fiscal policies together, you have a very substantial austerity program, which is imposed upon the already fallen and crestfallen middle Americans, and at the same time to conduct a program of bailing out the criminals who had led to the discontent of the many, to the tune of around $15 trillion. Now, you don't need to be an expert in electoral politics, in political science, to know that this can't end well. That, the people are going to try to punish whoever has misled them that way. And, Donald Trump came along and he talked about the American carnage. When Obama, like Biden and Harris, much more recently in the last few weeks, were telling the American people that they've never had it so good, that he did magnificently and he should be given a Nobel Prize both in peace and economics for lifting them up from the ashes of what had crashed and burned in 2008. And people said no. I have no doubt that the vast majority of people who voted for Trump in 2016 and again this year, actually, they don't believe what Trump is telling them. I don't believe that people are foolish or that can be taken in. But what carried Trump over the finish line and allowed him to win was the fact that a very substantial number of people simply have given up on electoral politics. They don't believe that this is democracy, that they don't believe that their interests can ever be represented in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. So they end up with a very simple, tiny little choice that they can make. And they ask themselves, whom should we vote for to piss off this establishment that has done this to us? And the answer is Trump. Because, you only have to read the New York Times, the Washington Post, to listen to CNN, to MSNBC, and so on, to realize that, the establishment, the people who effectively toyed with them in 2008, before that under Bill Clinton, and so on, and George W. Bush, because George W. Bush and Bill Clinton were interchangeable when it came to economic policies. Really, I mean, there wasn't that much of a difference, except that the Republicans are a little bit more relaxed when it comes to austerity. They don't like austerity very much. Austerity, which is class war against the many, is a Democrat tool, choice, weapon of choice. So they said, okay, well, we'll vote for the man who will annoy this regime that has done this to us. That's what it is, really.
And there's something about this idea of make America great again. It's the idea that somehow in the past things were okay, and I'm going to bring it back, and I'm going to recognize that people are angry about the status quo, and all of the data backs up why people could be angry about the status quo. But in reality, this is a calling attention to anger and blaming the wrong people. In fact, those who are most suffering for all of the issues are, the people who built this country, who are migrants of all types. Um, Seems to be a dead end at the end of the day. Yet we had an alternative here in the United States. And it's not just about one person. We had a movement tied to Senator Bernie Sanders in 2016 and again in 2020 when I got to be involved, formally part of the campaign. And it represented also a recognition of people's feelings of dispossession, right? That feeling that, hey, I'm working harder than ever and I'm making less. And, noting here John Keynes's prediction that there would be a 15-hour work week with advancing technologies. So, again, what snuffed out this potential real populism? Well, I think we know what snuffed it out, but what do you think about how we can get that movement back and that energy back so people actually have real solutions on their hands to the problems and the thievery of their money by big corporations?
Let me begin with MAGA, with Make America Great Again. It is predicated upon a truth and a gross lie. The truth is that once upon a time, back in the 1970s, the American working class could look back 150 years to a continuous increase from generation to generation of their purchasing power, of their capacity to buy stuff. For 150 years, it was unbroken, even during the Great Depression. If you look only at the employed, forget the unemployed, even when wages were falling, they were falling more slowly than prices were falling. So incomes, even during the wage depression, of those who were lucky enough to keep their jobs, were going up. So wages were going up for 150 years until we hit the mid-1970s. And from that moment, they stagnate. It's a big discussion as to why. It's got to do with the manner in which American capitalism transformed itself as the United States went from being a surplus country to being a deficit country. But that's another big discussion. So when somebody like Trump says, give me all power, make me dictator for a day, and I will make America great again, he is effectively speaking to that common memory, that collective memory, that once upon a time, working class people could imagine a world in which their children were better off than them. Now they can't. So when this MAGA acronym effectively evokes that emotion and that memory. And so this is the truth on which it is based. Of course, the lie on which it is based is that he's going to make things come back to that situation by, as you said before, focusing on the stock exchange and real estate. And here I think it's important to point out why this is not difficult, but impossible. This is an impossibility theory, if you want. It's not a litany of difficulties that the project faces. This is why it is not possible. So I mentioned before that after 1971, with the demise of Bretton Woods, when America went from being a deficit country to a surplus country to being a deficit country, something remarkable happened. Remarkable from the perspective of human history or the history of capitalism. For the first time, a hegemon, the United States, grew stronger militarily, financially, geopolitically, when it went deeply into the red. Up until the 1970s, every empire or hegemon that slipped from a surplus to a deficit position lost its hegemony. Whether it was the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, uh, going into the red meant a fall from grace. Not with the United States. The more deeply into the red its trade balance went, the more powerful it became. And why? Why is that? Well, once the United States trade deficit started getting substantial, that meant that the first 2 decades of the post-war era were reversed. In the 1950s and 60s, America had a surplus. It was exporting more than it was importing. And the way it managed to do that after the war, when Europe and Japan were in ashes, essentially, and didn't even have a monetary system, was essentially by dollarizing Europe and Japan. So American dollars were sent to Europe either as aid, the Marshall Plan, or as loans, similarly with Japan. But then with every Cadillac or Westinghouse refrigerator or Boeing jet that was being sold to the Europeans, to the Japanese, a wad of dollars was being repatriated. So this was a nice little recycling system. Right? But once the Vietnam War and changes in the trade balance and so on turned America into a deficit state, there was a flood of dollars going to Europe and to Japan, a constant tsunami. And given them America's obligation to change those dollars for American gold, at some point, Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August 1971, stepped in and said, no more. And he cut off all the fixed exchange rates. This whole post-war model, the Bretton Woods model, was upended. And what happened at that point is that the central banks of Europe and Japan were in a panic because they were full of these dollars. They didn't know what to do with them. If they exchanged them for their own currency would go up because the demand for their currency would go up. And then German exports, Japanese exports, French exports would suffer even more. So instead of doing that, they took the wads of dollars that they had in their bank accounts, in their books, and they took it to New York, where they, Europeans and Japanese, and then later the Chinese, purchased American debt. So you have this situation where, and this is magnificent, preposterous, loathsome, and very admirable and worrying at the same time. You have a very weird recycling mechanism. The American trade deficit, which keeps expanding, right? And especially after China entered the World Trade Organization under Bill Clinton, it expanded even further with effectively whole production lines being shifted from the United States to China and the carnage that Donald Trump is talking about taking place in Middle America. The trade deficit expands. As it expands, it does 2 things. Firstly, it becomes a huge vacuum cleaner, which is sucking into the United States the exports of the German capitalists, the Chinese capitalists, the Japanese capitalists. Okay? At the same time, those capitalists, what do they do with the dollars that they earn? Well, they take it to New York and they fund the American state, the American military. They fund real estate. They fund the stock exchange. So this is now I'm about to prove, in inverted commas, my impossibility theorem. When Donald Trump promises to eliminate the trade deficit in order to reindustrialize the Midwest and so on, what he's not telling us, or the people that have elected him, is that if he does that, he can do that. It is possible to do that, to eliminate the trade deficit. But then there will be no capital flowing from Japan, China, Germany, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, back into New York to fund what? The stock exchange and the real estate sector. So if he fulfills his promise to the American hardworking Americans, if he is to fulfill the promise to them to eliminate the trade surplus of China, of Japan, of Germany, then he will have effectively to cause a plummeting of the stock exchange and the real estate values in Miami, New York, and California. So he has to choose either betray the working class that voted him in or betray his mates. Guess what he's going to do?
I think we saw what he did last time. He passed the biggest tax cut in United States history, about 98 to 99% disproportionately privileged, the top 1% of the population. So then this question about what do we do about this situation, about what we could call a progressive movement, about leaders like Senator Sanders who remain quite trusted by Americans. There was perhaps a miscalculation made by many of us in the progressive movement that we could transform the Democratic Party so that someone like Senator Sanders or someone else perhaps could serve as the face of it, who actually was aligned, because we do see Americans again and again vote for economic populist policies, as long as they're not branded incorrectly, like unfortunately the Green New Deal was branded incorrectly, in my opinion.
I think that 2016 was the pivotal moment. Bernie did a remarkable job in the primaries in 2016 in creating a remarkable movement, his political revolution. Some like 800,000, 900,000 young people in particular were knocking doors, were mobilizing, fundraising. That movement was never going to be allowed to win the primaries. Never. The DNC, the Democratic Party's establishment, would rather blow up the world, nuke the planet, than allow Bernie Sanders to win. They stole the election, the primaries. We know from WikiLeaks what they did. And that reveals it's not just a truth regarding the United States, also the United Kingdom. See what they did, what the Labour Party did in order to prevent the Labour Party from winning while it was being led by somebody like Jeremy Corbyn. So the deep establishment within these, sort of centrist, radical centrist, social democratic parties, like the Democratic Party in America and the Labour Party in Britain, their number one priority is to stay in opposition rather than have somebody who is a progressive, a genuine progressive like Bernie, be made president. They are class warriors. They care about their social class, the bourgeoisie, the financiers, the rentiers, primarily the rentiers. They care more about that than they care about winning government. The big mistake that Bernie Sanders made, and I say this as a friend of Bernie Sanders, I've told him personally, it was a huge error of judgment after 2016, after the primaries, to support Hillary Clinton and to remain within the Democratic Party. These 800, 900,000 volunteers, activists, were ready and willing to form a third force. That was the moment to do it. I can't blame Bernie Sanders for that. These are monumental decisions. There is a lot of trepidation involved when you split from the political party which was your home for so many years. Even though he was never really a member of the Democratic Party, he always sat as an independent, right? But nevertheless, he worked with them for so many years. I know what it means to create a new party. I've done this here in Greece. It's extremely tiring and painful and fraught with difficulties. You're walking on a landmine field terrain, but he should have done it. On his coattails, the squad was elected, the Democratic Socialists and so on, and that was a good thing. But they are fading. And they are fading because the Democratic Party knows how to absorb, chew up, and spit out progressives within its ranks. And you can see that even after Kamala Harris's ridiculous performance, I mean, just such a terrible campaign. Yeah, she's coming out, the New York Times are coming out, and they are eulogizing the campaign as the best that they could have staged. So, and when it comes to when you ask them the question, so what went wrong? We were too left wing, we were too woke, we were too this, too that. Thankfully, today Joe Stiglitz came out in the Guardian with an article this morning saying that the Democrats must ditch neoliberal economics. Well, they need to ditch more than neoliberal economics. They need to ditch their allegiance to the rentiers, their allegiance to big tech, their allegiance to big capital. Of course, they will not do it because they belong to them. This is why a third force was always essential, This is why I would have voted for Jill Stein this in this election, and this is why I lament the 2016 moment because Ramesh, the truth is that we of the left, we progressives, don't get many opportunities in our lifetime to effect the change. We're like surfers. We bob up and down with the waves, getting cold, waiting for the good one. And if the good one comes, the good wave, and we miss it, then we have to wait and wait and wait again. So in our case here in Greece, our moment was 2015. When we were elected to government, we had a fantastic opportunity to create a rupture from the past and, to reconfigure politics in a progressive manner. We failed. Bernie Sanders had his chance a year later. He failed. I very much fear that, now we have to be good surfers and make sure that we don't miss the next wave. We can't create the waves.
Yeah, amen to that.
But we can prepare our people, our organization, our policies, our tactics, steel our nerves, and prepare for the next wave.
Because a set of policies like improving the minimum wage to a living wage, I mean, whether in Europe or here, is incredibly popular, giving people the basics of being able to, when they have a child, have a little bit of family leave, maybe even lowering a little bit of money, heaven forbid, from the military industrial complex. All of these are actually, as piecemeal, remarkably popular proposals to Americans. It's just, how can a political entity form around on those issues that actually most people agree around? And that's just me musing.
It's not you musing, this is the truth. The fact is that our republics, because they're not really democracies, we have oligarchy with elections.
Oligarchy, yeah.
Our republics were set up to ensure that what is popular, what people want, does not happen.
Yeah.
That's what, the way that our constitution, your constitution, our constitution was created, was to ensure that. Representative democracy was designed, if you read the federal papers, it was designed to keep the riffraff out, to keep the demos out of democracy. That's the whole point of the republic, to keep the demos out of the democracy, to have the mechanics of democracy, the election, the rules for representation in Congress and so on and so on, without having the demos imposing its will on government. So we've always done that.
And this also reminds me of comments you make often that, what we actually have is an oligarchic system of governance. And actually, to exceptionalize, people like Elon Musk, while he's exceptionally absurd, in my opinion, in certain ways, it takes away from the reality that throughout American history and throughout much of global history, it was oligarchs who had power and maintained power, and this was always, and maintained power over the political apparatus.
I mean, I'm so incensed that so many people are being upset by Elon Musk's closeness to Donald Trump. He's irrelevant.
The media loves it. Yeah,
he's irrelevant. Yeah, on both sides. Yeah. The pro-Trump crowd love it because, oh, look, we have the great man with us. And the liberal press is aghast that an oligarch has power. What? Yeah. In the United States, you're aware that an oligarch has power. Who created the bloody Federal Reserve? Excuse my French. It was J.P. Morgan. He created it. It was in his own home.
Yeah.
He brought the other bankers and some people from government and said, listen, guys, I've had enough of bailing out other banks. So we're going to create the Federal Reserve, and we're going to create the way I tell you that we're going to create it. And it's going to be completely and totally dependent on Wall Street. And so the central bank independence was introduced as independence of the Federal Reserve, not from government, from the people, from the demos, right? So that the demos could not even vote out anyone who had the opportunity to change the policy of the Federal Reserve. So, to be worried about Elon Musk in a country where everything is run by oligarchic, large-scale capital is absurd. It's absurd. Anyway, I think that Elon Musk is going to have a row with Donald Trump within 12 months and leave.
And that would be
without,
that will be a number one media sensation. Much of that is about sensation
yeah.
chasing and attention optimizing, which I know we're going to talk about in a bit when we talk about technology and where all of that is heading. But it's a really powerful moment when we see how the big corporate donors that actually run the United States and much of the planet will are happy to meet either Trump or Kamala Harris and would prefer either definitely than someone like Bernie Sanders. And so that leaves us in the place we're at now.
They are more or less indifferent between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
That's right.
They know that they will be served quite nicely. They may have their own preferences, but in the same way that you can have preferences between different basketball teams or
Yeah. No, it's very much true. It's now we're sitting through this time where it reminds me your point about looking for the right wave and taking it when it's there, like looking for it reminds me of comments made by activists in Egypt. I used to do my field work in in and around Egypt, not just Tahrir Square, all over Egypt, looking at the wave of Arab Spring revolutions at that time. And at that time, I was working a little with Al Jazeera, and activists told me, as they were incredibly depressed with what occurred in 2013. I remember like being there when it occurred. We're just going to keep our eye. We're going to just have a long view and look for the next moment where another Arab Spring can occur, next for the next moment where another Occupy can occur. That's me saying this in relation to Occupy. And that's a very powerful force. One last kind of geopolitical question I want to ask you. It's, as an economist, but also, a public political figure. Um, what do you think about this, the BRICS reorganization and these BRICS meetings? Brazil, Russia, for our lay audience, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but of course, many other countries have sort of signed on. They've had a couple meetings, including in Russia and in China. And what do you see a possibility where a global currency, could be introduced that could actually knock the U.S. off its socks, which is really the power of the U.S. dollar, which I know, and do you believe that the power of the U.S. dollar is directly tied to U.S. military, sort of, let's say, incursions and presence around the world?
I think that the direction of causality is the opposite. I think it's the hegemony of the American dollar, which allows the American state to be able to fund its military. Along the lines of what I was saying earlier, because of the hegemony of the dollar, you have the American trade deficit not causing the dollar to fall, but causing a capital flow from the rest of the world to New York and through Wall Street, and mass purchases of U.S. treasuries to fund the American state, which funds the American military. On the BRICS, well, a general comment first, if I may. In New York, in London, in Brussels, I think the opinion makers, the commentariat, are underestimating the significance of the BRICS. At the same time, in the global south, people who are so eager, they're yearning for an alternative to the dollar and to American hegemony, they're overestimating the importance of the BRICS. The BRICS is important because what you have here is coalescence of different countries with very different outlooks. Indeed, countries that are almost at war with one another, like India and China. And yet, they have a common interest, which they manage somehow to serve through the BRICS discussions and institutions. They have a common interest in moving out of the tyranny of the Federal Reserve, of the IMF, of the American dollar-based payment system. But let me come to your question as to whether that would mean a common currency. They need something far more than what they have already established, which is not to be scoffed at. They have established an alternative payment system, not currency, whereby you can send money from India to Russia to buy Russian oil and bypass the sanctions and the dollar payment system. But this in itself is not the foundation of a common currency, because through this process you end up with, Moscow holding a lot of rupiah, a lot of the Indian currency, which it doesn't want because it wants to buy things from China. And it's down to China whether it will accept the Indian rupees for selling things to Putin or to Russian companies. So in the end, whether you are going to have an alternative to the American dollar will hinge on a very simple question. Does China want to be hegemonic within the BRICS? And to me, it's not at all clear that it does. Because if it does, then what would it need to do in order to create a common currency, essentially, an alternative to the dollar, not just an alternative, plumbing for shifting existing domestic currencies around, but for also, a common currency system backed by the Chinese yuan. Well, what it would take is something very similar to what the United States did in Bretton Woods in 1944. Essentially, in the same way that America dollarized Europe and Japan through Bretton Woods, it fixed exchange rates and created a link between the American dollar and gold, essentially sharing its gold to some extent within the limits of capital controls with the French, with the Germans, with the Japanese, and so on. And this is how the post-war dollar zone was created. Now, the Chinese can do that. There's no doubt they can do it. Okay, they're a surplus country, like the United States were a surplus country in 1944, 1950, 1960, and they can do it. But for that, they will need to decide that they want to be hegemonic. Now, from my contacts with the Chinese powerful circles, they don't want that. The Chinese Communist Party is not the Soviet Communist Party. They do not want to rule the world. They are not imperialistic at all. And please don't start talking about, not you, but our audience, talking about Taiwan and Tibet and Hong Kong. For them, this is China. Okay, it's Chinese territory that was lost, forfeited during the empire wars and so on. They don't want to rule Mexico. They don't want to rule India. They do not want to rule Sri Lanka. They do not want to rule Greece. They want to trade. And it is very clear, all the companies, the Chinese companies that deal with the rest of the world are under very strict instructions never to interfere politically with anyone. It's just on the quantity and the quality of their products and the price of their products. That's all they care. Besides that, it's not just a antipathy of the regime in China, in Beijing, towards hegemony. It's far more, if you want, class-oriented than that. And let me be more specific. If you are a Chinese capitalist, a traditional Chinese capitalist in Shenzhen or in Shanghai, producing, let's say, aluminum, and which you sell to California, the last thing you want is an alternative to the dollar, because your demand depends on the predominance of the dollar, because the Americans are buying your aluminum only because they have the privilege of the dollar, because they are a deficit country. If America loses the privilege, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, right, the hegemony of the dollar, then they won't be able to buy your things because they are in the red. Okay, so if you're a Chinese capitalist, of the traditional kind, then you don't want the one to become, within the BRICS, a common currency that steals the thunder from the US dollar. So inside the Communist Party of China, the Central Committee, there are members of the Central Committee who are against challenging the power of the dollar. Then there are, of course, others who are far more interested in that. Then there is the big tech, the gigantic technology, what I call the cloud capital of China, like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and so on, who don't mind a common currency with the BRICS because it will be one that is powered by their algorithms. So there is a boisterous class conflict going on within the Chinese Communist Party. You see, here in the West, we imagine it's a monolithic thing and it's whatever Xi Jinping says and so on. This is rubbish. The
Mm.
debates within the Chinese Communist Party in China are far more interesting, intellectually charged, and politically mature and rich than anything we have in our congresses or parliaments.
Yeah, very telling. And most of the research I've looked at, and even in times I've done field work in East Africa, you see a number of Chinese initiatives, so-called New Silk Road or One Belt, One Road initiatives. And most of the research I've looked at has shown very clearly that in exchange for, those forms of aid, some are better, some are worse, like building roads and so on. The Chinese do not interfere in those nations' political institutions. So that's very consistent with some of the research I've looked at least in a few countries.
What I've been telling my Chinese friends is that um, the attempt to be politically neutral is not a politically neutral strategy. Because when you go to Zambia or to Greece or to Ethiopia and you try to be
Right.
politically neutral, then and you build something, you build an airport, you build a road, an electricity grid, a port, right? Um, you are, whether you like it or not, whether this is your intention or not, you are interfering. So, for instance, if the people that you work with, contractors, are part of a nasty regime, of a regime which is oppressive to the working class, to the community, it destroys its amenities and its public space and so on, and you work with them because you have a non-interference political attitude, well, still you're interfering with the local politics. But
Absolutely.
from a geopolitical point of view,
Yeah.
it is still true that China doesn't want to be a hegemon.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. You can't actually not interfere. But this sort of dates back to, the Second World being China, right? And this older history. Um, so obviously, technology and where digital technologies are heading are catalytic in all of these transformations we're seeing around the planet, from the erosion of what we could call a public sphere and grassroots journalism to even being in a single space where we all sort of may see the same thing or observe the same news or even engage with one another or learn from one another. And all, what we have seen occurred is a massive takeover of a few, very, very few platforms, taking over all of our interactions with one another, from our communications right now via Zoom. Zoom monetizes this data to any interaction between a buyer and a seller, right? So these tech platforms are in the business of hiring almost nobody, spending almost no money on wages or salaries, and owning almost nothing. That's quite a remarkable business model. And so you astutely described this as techno feudalism, and we'll make sure people can access the book as well in the description. It's fantastic work, and in that you describe the extraction of value in every transaction, from data to our attention to our labor to our activity to even, I would say, the hormones in our body, which drive attention. And so I want to speak to you, of course, and you speak about this all the time. I know that. What do we do about, want to talk about massive, essentially near monopolistic power over this internet that we actually all paid for originally as US taxpayers, and is using all of our data and our attention? We are the commodity being sold, right?
Well, thank you for asking this question because, I wrote this book which stirred up quite a lot of controversy, especially amongst the left. And our audience will know why when I spell out the subtitle. So the book is called Techno-Feudalism. The subtitle is what killed capitalism.
Yeah.
That's a major claim to make, that capitalism is dead. How can I possibly be saying that? Wherever you look, wherever we turn around us, we see the triumph of capital, and it's true. And the technology that you refer to is another form of capital. They're capital goods. They're not pie in the sky. They don't live in the cloud. I call it cloud capital, but it's nothing to do with the cloud, right? The actual cloud. It's all on Earth, and it's machinery. It's whole factories of servers and optic fiber cables and cell towers and machinery.
And
Not
satellites, right? Hence Musk and Starlink and space tech.
Starlink and all that. So what killed capitalism? It wasn't the left, unfortunately. It was a form of capital, which I call cloud capital, which is a mutation. It's a mutant form of capital. So this, I think it's important for people not to lose themselves in the complexity of big tech, because big tech is extremely complex. We can talk about surveillance, we can talk about the attention economy, we can talk about big data, the way our data is harvested. All that is pertinent. It's part and parcel of what I call technofeudalism. But the thing to focus on, so as not to be distracted by the trees, and then therefore we end up losing sight of the forest, is that here we have a new form of capital. This is my proposition. And it is the first time in the history of capitalism, of humanity, that there's been such a mutation of capital. Now, capital has pre-existed capitalism, of course, right? And what I'm saying is that it is also transcending capitalism. It existed before capitalism, it exists and will exist after capitalism. So anything we produce in order to use it to produce something else is capital. It's a capital good. So a fishing rod is not produced in order to be consumed, it's produced in order to catch fish. A tractor is produced not in order to be driven around, unless you're mad, but in order to cultivate the land and produce corn or wheat or whatever. So these are capital goods. And of course, they pre-exist capitalism. We had them in ancient societies, we had them in feudal Europe, we had them in before capitalism. With capitalism, what happened was that the power to extract other people's products or produce shifted from owning land. Under feudalism, if you owned land, you owned the right, you had the right, you had won the right, you had the power to send the sheriff to the peasants and collect half the harvest, 60% of the harvest for yourself. So your extractive power depended on owning land. With capitalism, your extractive power depended on owning machines, capital, produced means of production, like, steam engines and textile factories and electricity grids and the telegraph poles and the television stations and, Thomas Edison's and Westinghouse's, powerhouses and all that. But the transformation, the mutation of capital into what I call cloud capital has given birth to a new form of capital, which is not a produced means of production. So, Instagram, TikTok, your phone itself, your laptop, which is interfaced with this cloud capital. I have this, you can see this Google Assistant. I also have an Alexa. This is all part of my research for my book, right? Alexa, which is the interface that you buy in order to connect to Amazon.
Sure.
What's the point of Alexa? I mean, for a user, Alexa is a mechanical slave. You say to it, order me a pizza, remind me at 10 o'clock to put a coffee on, switch off the lights, get me this book through Amazon. It appears like a slave, but it's not, of course. It's an interface with Amazon's, Jeff Bezos's cloud capital. And essentially, it's sitting there on your desk, and you're training it to know you. You're training it to train you, to train it better, to train you better, to train it better, to know you. And at some point, it gives you a very good piece of advice. So, if I want to read your book, it says, well, if you like this book, then you may like that other book. And always, it is a good recommendation. I have never seen a recommendation from Alexa that is not a good one for me. It ranges between being good and being great. Never bad.
The Spotify ones are very good too. There are quite a few, right?
Of course. So, and therefore, this is what it does. you train it to train you to train it, to give you good advice. And then once it is giving you a good advice, then it has you. Because we are humans. Any good advice we get means that the next piece of advice may also be good. So then, this is enormous power by Alexa, effectively Jeff Bezos, to put into my mind that I really need this pair of binoculars, which I may really never need. But, if and suddenly it has input into my heart, a desire. You may say, well, is this new? I mean, isn't that what advertising does? Of course, this is what advertising does. But advertising before Cloud Capital was a one-way street.
Yeah.
The advertiser would come up with a brilliant campaign. You would see the advertisement either on television or on a poster, and suddenly you would want a Big Mac. You don't need it, you don't want it, but you're going to buy it. And then that's the end of the relationship with the advertiser. It's one way. You have in your heart, in your mouth, in your stomach, wherever it is, this desire for a Big Mac. Then you go to McDonald's and you buy it. But with Alexa, she's convinced you to buy these binoculars, and then she sells them to you directly. You don't go to a shop.
Right.
And Jeff Bezos collects 35, 40% of the price you paid from the capitalist who's created the binoculars. So surplus value, which is created in the traditional capitalist sector, is siphoned off by cloud capital in the form of cloud rent. This is rent. This is not profit. This is what it's not just that he doesn't own anything. He doesn't produce anything, Jeff Bezos. Unlike, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison and, Henry Ford were megalomaniacs, capitalists like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. But the difference is that, Ford's factories were making the stuff that he wanted to sell to you.
Right.
Doesn't make anything. He simply creates the cloud platform, the cloud fief, I call it, in which he concentrates you and me and sellers and makes us transact with one another with a system which is the wet dream, or would have been the wet dream, of the Soviet planning agency Gosplan, because this is what Gosplan was trying to do, to replace the market with an algorithm matching sellers and buyers. So, Jeff Bezos has that which the Soviet Union never did, managed to create, to design. But his objective is not social welfare. His objective is maximization of his cloud rents. And the reason why, as you said before, he pays a pittance to workers. Only 1%, 2% of these cloud capitalists' revenues go to salaries, which is remarkable because for Ford and General Motors and General Electric and all these large traditional corporations, 85% goes to salaries and wages. 85% goes to salaries and wages, or used to at least. The reason is because, what really gives capital value, the capacity to accumulate capital, to cloud capital, to Instagram, to TikTok, to X, formerly Twitter. It is your tweets, your posts, your photographs, your views, your videos. So effectively, we are cloud serfs. We are working for free to accumulate capital. This is what is important. So I don't care, what they know about me. I'm not. I mean, I know the NSA is following me very, very, not judicially, diligently, right? So I know that my life is any notion of privacy has gone away. What I care about is not what they know. I care about what they own. And they own this capital, cloud capital, which has really replaced both markets and profit. It replaced markets with these cloud fiefs and profits with rents. So we have a new form of a socioeconomic mode of production. By the way, in my book, let me be very clear on this to our audience. My book is a purely Marxist analysis. It's an analysis of capital accumulation and the new forms of capital. And through this Marxist prism, I'm saying that, cloud capital has killed off or is killing off capitalism and replacing it with something worse, which I call techno-feudalism.
And it's interesting because, a lot of early algorithms before, everything just got called algorithm were what we call data mining algorithms, text mining algorithms. They still use that term. But it's interesting the way we are actually being mined for our data that in a sense construct our desire, which actually is also in turn making us more mineable in a sense. And And there's something interesting about this at scale. So some of it is the construction of desire and giving you the things that oh yeah, I always wanted this and now I am someone who wants this. But some of it is actually the outcomes of these different algorithms are to leave us feeling anxious, to leave young women feeling like they are not beautiful enough. Like on Instagram, we're seeing clear evidence of that. Some of them leave us with the feeling we call FOMO, fear of missing out. Um, and some of us and some of these different platforms leave us, provide us with more and more, like, if you will, hardcore content, right? Like the YouTube recommendation algorithm. So there's different outputs, but all of them follow the same pattern that you're describing, which is the construction of consumption, the construction of desire, and so on. And so I want to ask you then, what we're seeing though is at scale. I don't want to simply say this is caused by technology, but I think we can bring up, good old Emil Durkheim right now as well. But we're seeing a sense that in contemporary, certainly in many Western nations, people feel, and especially younger people feel, a profound sense of isolation, loneliness, and a sense of placelessness that in some ways resembles what Durkheim described as anomie, a long time ago. Um, and I guess I want to just ask you about that. If you feel like you wish to comment on that, like that sense of that all of these forces might be generating some, and including the ones we described earlier in this podcast, are leaving people feeling more and more atomized, more fragmented, more disconnected from community, and therefore more isolated and more divided. And technologies that bring death, like assault weapons or fentanyl, are now increasingly embraced, at least here in the United States.
Of course, of course. Look, the beauty culture, the lifestyle revolution of the 60s and 70s, the whole advertising business, which is so beautifully captured by Mad Men, the series. This predated cloud capital. What cloud capital has done is to turbocharge it and to turn it into, as you described it, a dialectical process. This one-way thing goes. I mean, once upon a time, a young girl would get a Cosmo magazine and or Vogue and go through it. It's one way from the magazine, from the paper to your brain. Bad enough. In order to, because essentially, as Habermas also said, this is the whole process of consumer capitalism, cultivating expectations in your soul that can never be fulfilled, and therefore creating a sense of constant loss. We've always done that. This is not new. What is new is, the dialectical relationship that, with Instagram, unlike with Vogue or Cosmo, you're constantly interacting. You're teaching it to find new ways of making you feel the void within you. And the more the void within you increases, the more you interact with the machine to try to fill it. And then the greater the void becomes. But allow me, Ramesh, to mention something else, which I think is really, related, but somehow different and crucial. The end of the illusion of liberalism, of the sovereign self. Any economic student back in the 1970s, when I started learning economics, was told something about consumer sovereignty, that your desires and your utility function was your own, and that the market was there as a servant to ensure that your utility was maximized given your constraints. The idea that the market was an instrument that you used to serve your sovereign desires and passions. That is gone. The whole neoliberal revolution and libertarianism was about elevating the market from a means to an end, from an instrument to a divinity that must be served, that it knows better than us. I mean, when Hayek used to say that, the beauty about the market is that it tells me what I want. Right? Because, I remember him giving a lecture that I attended many, many years ago. And he said, this morning I walked into a shop and I left with something I didn't think I wanted.
Mm.
And it's that beautiful. So the market is no longer your servant. It is your master. And this is to be celebrated. So you have a situation where, once upon a time, this delineation of the market from the self was part and parcel of liberalism. It was part of what it meant to be a free and autonomous person. And that involved a demarcation, a fence dividing your working life from your leisure, or leisure, as you would say in America, right?
Sure.
But the moment your leisure becomes part and parcel of social media, and you have youngsters who are, on Snapchat, on Instagram, on this, that, and the other, and they love it. And you can't really take those machines away from them, right? And understandably, I cannot live with my phone, without my phone, right? To be honest with you. Um, but at some point, subconsciously, these youngsters realize, no, that when they are interviewed for a job, in 5 years' time, 5 months' time, 10 years' time, the bot that is going, because it will be a bot, it won't even be a human being, that will sort out, the ones who will be shortlisted for the job, is going to go through their social media profile. So that thought tonight, you have a youngster in bed playing with her phone and, tweeting or uploading a video or a photo or some comment on Snapchat, right? Deep down, even if it's not conscious, they know that some recruitment bot or agent is going to be looking at that, which means that at that moment, usually subconsciously, that's more insidious, they will be worrying, should I post this? What image does it project of me? And then the second order existentialist angst emerges because, companies like Google like to tell people, be yourself. We want to employ you. We are going to hire you if you're thinking out of the box and you are spontaneous. So suddenly they have the existentialist angst, those kids, to be spontaneous, which is the greatest philosophical fallacy ever. You cannot try to be. If you try to be spontaneous, you end up in an existentialist drama. Okay, in a deep personal crisis. If you're trying to be spontaneous, so. Suddenly, it's 11 o'clock at night, it's midnight. You have a youngster in bed. This is not autonomy. They are in a dialectical, warp speed relationship with a future labor market bot recruiting them.
Yeah.
So this idea of the separation between work and play, employment, paid employment, and leisure has gone.
Right.
So even if you're a liberal,
right.
you should just throw your arms up in the air in disgust at our techno-feudal era.
And in a sense, it's about you start performing for your perceptions of of an algorithm, in a sense. And this really directly relates to cautioning words that Aldous Huxley himself actually mentioned to Mike Wallace, like in when he wrote this book, The Enemies of Freedom, or essay, The Enemies of Freedom, where he said the most powerful prison, I'm paraphrasing here, is one that we create for ourselves based on our own ideas of what we desire. But it's all built upon this two-way dialectical relationship. I think that's the key part. That's what makes this distinct from, the stories of Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, who's kind of an inventor of modern propaganda, or even, other subconscious propaganda, subliminal advertising, these sorts of things. This doesn't hold a candle to this in many ways.
You're curate. I mean, there's nothing wrong with trying to curate yourself. But when you're trying to curate yourself in accordance to what you expect a recruiter from Google will want yourself to be curated like, and you don't even know what this Google recruiter wants yourself to be curated like, but you're trying to imagine.
Anxiety creates a lot of anxiety. Yeah. And the recruiter is a bot itself, and that's a whole other point, right? We're already seeing many HR recruitment systems be these sort of machine learning algorithms that tend to be highly discriminatory, of course, certainly against working people or people who don't have that level of sort of self-presentation in digital ways that would curate their identity, but also around racial, gendered, etc. lines. So that's already baked into
There's a macroeconomic component to this because the more power goes to the cloud capital owners, I call them cloudalists, the smaller the percentage of jobs which are not bullshit jobs. And the smaller the percentage of good jobs, the more applications arrive at a company that advertise these non-bullshit jobs, which means that even if you and I were recruitment agents, we would be algorithmically sifting through them. You
Mhm.
don't have the time to go through them properly. So essentially, it makes even sense to have a bot as a
Yeah.
recruitment agent. So this thing, is a self-reinforcement loop,
Yes.
leading to hell, to nothing less than hell.
Absolutely. And there's this big question I also been wanting to ask you, and I think about this quite a bit, which is, consider the profound domains or terrains to which um, technology has extended to turn everything into, or attempt to turn everything into data. Like what in our lives should not be expressed through quantifiable, calculable, or computable numbers. Certainly those collected by corporations and states, and so there's of course the obscenity of corporate surveillance, state surveillance, and those in power abusing further power using these technologies again that we all pay for that are using all of us constantly. But on top of it, it's ontological really. It's what shouldn't be expressed through numbers, right? Like should everything be expressed through numbers? And in this I just want to ask you this question about what I feel might be the death of reason. And here I'm alluding to the work of Achille Bembe, the philosopher who influences me a lot. And, has reason been replaced by correlation, which is a type of reasoning? So, like, if we want to talk about AI, these generative AI systems, for example, they're mainly using pattern recognition through probabilistic inference, what they call stochastic modeling, right? That seems like an extremely limited part of even human intelligence, let alone non-human intelligence, right? So I guess I just want to ask you that question of whether, these opaque technologies that are ordering and disciplining, in a sense, in a almost in a biopolitic sense, whether those technologies now have actually supplanted reason with pattern recognition, and whether this is actually any type of intelligence that we're really embarking upon here.
Well, this is a process which started in the 19th century, not just now. The machines are simply turbocharging it and bringing it to its logical conclusion. But Ramesh, let me remind our audience that when at the beginning of capitalism, when people, and especially intelligent people, were really aghast at what was going on, because when capitalism was born, there was, of course, a lot of new wealth that was being created, but new forms of depravity, new forms of poverty that never existed before, right? And political economy emerged. And
Yeah.
the first political economists, even those who were highly supportive of capitalism, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, set out to create an understanding, a logical analysis, a rational analysis of this beast, capitalism. Uh, but, economics, political economy never made it into the mainstream,
Mm.
never made it into the universities until all qualities turned into quantities,
Ah,
until quantification became the bedrock of economics. So if you ask Adam Smith about um, pleasure and desire, he would say to you that this is a totally subjective thing that better left as a quality to the individual.
right.
His analysis was based on, a production approach, on the division of labor, on the distribution of income between capitalists and workers and rentiers. Uh, they had the idea that value was created in proportion to the amount of human labor which was necessary in order to produce something. And if you ask them, okay, so how do you measure this labor? They said, well, you don't really, because it's a quality more than a quantity, and don't even try.
Mm.
But for economics to become established as a science, a pseudoscience. Remember, the Nobel Prize in economics it's a fake one. It was instituted by the Central Bank of Sweden as a separate thing. How did it happen? Well, they took Bentham's original utilitarianism, which was a qualitative approach, the purpose of which was to introduce the idea of redistribution. So Bentham wanted to convince people that when you have a stinking rich person and a very poor person, it is incumbent upon society to tax the rich and give it to the poor. But in order not to sound like a moralist, he came up with the notion of utility, which is this abstract idea of satisfaction, of net joy, joy
Mm.
minus pain. And he said if you have diminishing marginal utility, in other words, the more you have of something, whatever that something is, the more you appreciate the last unit that you had. Well, if that applies to everybody, and the good society is the one that maximizes utility on average, then you take $1 from Jeff Bezos and give it to a poor person. The utility that Bezos will lose will be much, much, much less than the utility that the poor person will get. So that justifies the good society taxing the rich and giving to the poor. So that was a qualitative argument. It wasn't meant to plug people into a machine and measure the microwatts of utility
Right.
one from an ice cream, right? But then economics became established when suddenly it became a copy of physics, where instead of having the principle of energy conservation of Isaac Newton, which you could have because energy, mass, specific gravity are measurable and should be measurable and should be measured, right? Otherwise, you don't understand how nature works. We did the same thing as economists, right? And we have, if you look at what undergraduate and postgraduate students learn about economics, it's all about a model of the world in which each one of us is a bot maximizing a well-defined mathematical function called utility, which is utterly measurable, right? Or at least utterly mathematically definable. And through
Maximizing self-utility. Right.
self,
Yeah.
right? They dropped the idea of average utility because this would be too leftist, because it would, along the lines of Bentham, recommend redistribution. So everybody is what's Homo economicus? It is an automaton with zero self-reflective capacity, no capacity to say, I want this, but should I want this? This is banned because this is supposed to be, you have consumer sovereignty. So your preferences are your preferences, and nobody, even yourself, is allowed to ask about your preferences. So, if you look at the Fed's macroeconomic models of consumption, of investment, of this or that, if you look at Goldman Sachs, if you look at whoever, you'll find that inside those financial models, the models of the macroeconomy, the models of the green transition even, you'll find a world depicted as a sequence of bots maximizing well-specified utility functions with everything that matters being quantifiable. Now, that was before cloud capital came along. So what do you expect when cloud capital comes along? It simply takes this to the power of nth.
Absolutely. And everything and anything could be kind of transacted in that sort of logic, right? In some sense. Um, Two final questions. I mean, the last one we want to end with talking about another now. And so we want to end on that note of what life with all these technologies could look like in a way that support us all, support all beings. But before that, one more on some of the perversity, which is so, many of these platforms, right? These, cloud providers, cloud dominant companies, have strange economic models, right? Amazon was not profitable for the first decade or so of its existence. Uber rarely made any money, was not profitable until fairly recently. But they certainly are now, and all the while, in both cases, were worth at different times hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more. Um, so what I'm asking about is sort of some of the oddities associated with these tech platforms, where you go for valuation, you don't necessarily pay attention to actual revenues, and all of this seems to further and further dispossess everybody from consumers. I mean, forget consumer sovereignty. What about worker sovereignty or worker power? But basically, all of this leaves everybody else in the dark. So basically, we're in this data extractive economy where the platforms themselves don't always necessarily follow traditional models around profitability and so on. So there's this zombification, and I think this is a word you used actually, of digital economies. So I want to ask what we should do about this, of course. You and I have talked about one of your proposals was the idea of a universal basic dividend, but there are dozens of proposals actually that could be occurred that could be implemented. The question is how to implement any of these. And I want to ask you that, given that some of the strange things associated with some of the tech bazillionaires, the intense interest in leaving the planet, the intense interest in transhumanism and creating androids that make them live forever or bring back dead parents. So there's a lot of oddness that some of it is very science fiction like, um, built upon a perverse economy. So for the rest of us, the 99.9% of us who are living in the here and now and live with some level of modesty, what do we do about this? And what can be done to actually transform and check some of the power of big tech?
Well, to begin with, the process by which we ended up with cloud capital being so dominant, to the extent that it brought me to to the point of arguing that this is no longer capitalism, is state issued money. 9 out of every $10 that went into the creation of cloud capital came from the Fed, from the Bank of Japan, from the Bank of England, from the Central Bank of England, from state banks. It wasn't intentional. I'm not saying that central banks wanted to help Jeff Bezos become Jeff Bezos. It was after 2008 when they panicked at the collapse of Wall Street, at the collapse of really existing capitalism. 2008 was a remarkable moment, especially, I'm saying this for younger people who don't remember. Don't underestimate how crucial that free fall was. So they panicked, and between 2009 and 2024, 23, they printed $35 trillion altogether, those central banks together. And this was happening at a time when there was austerity for the many, which meant that companies didn't want to invest. Because why do you want to invest when the many are impecunious and they will not buy your stuff? So, $35 trillion went into the pockets of the big companies. And what they did was most of them, they bought back their own shares to push the stock exchange up. Only few companies invested in capital, and those were the big tech companies, and they invested in cloud capital. So essentially, it's with our money that they built up that cloud capital. Let's not forget that. So, and I'm saying this because, under capitalism, not just under techno-feudalism, you have this remarkable dominant ideology that somehow, wealth is produced individually and then collectivized by the state through the tax system. No, it's exactly the opposite. Wealth is produced collectively and then is privatized by the most powerful people in society. So that's point number one, right? So it is socially produced cloud capital, which has been privatized by people like Bezos and Zuckerberg and Gates.
And we actually subsidize this without our.
We paid for it. We didn't subsidize. We paid for it, and we paid for it to be constructed, and now we are replenishing, accumulating with our free labor.
And they're not paying any taxes either.
So the answer to the question, what should be done, must be a good old-fashioned socialist answer. We produce the bloody thing. We need to take control of it. So I'm all for cloud capital. We need cloud capital. In the same way that we need electricity generating stations, and we need power grids and telephone lines and roads and trucks and all that. The question is, who owns it? And that leads me to that novel that I wrote, Another Now. I think that what we need to do is we need to change corporate law very simply. One person, one share, one vote. That would be a remarkable transformation. It's not enough, because you may end up with a socialized, democratized corporation, which nevertheless still monopolizes and exploits the rest of society on behalf of the worker cooperative that owns it. So you need checks and balances, you need regulators which I think should be comprised of jury systems, that is, randomly selected members of the public, rather than bureaucrats that can be captured by the vested interests. Of course, this is a very long and complex conversation. This is why I wrote this book, Another Now, which you were kindly
Perfect
mentioned.
timing. I mean, it's
Yeah,
perfect timing. So, Owen Jones says on the cover of your book, which is Another Now, which I have in my possession, science fiction novel that you wrote, Yanis, is if you're looking for a sense of optimism, which is very powerful given our conversation so far, a sense of political possibility, this book is very important. And within it, I know you've told me before you love Star Trek as well, and you are viewing and looking at a future, obviously, that involves all these digital technologies, but one that actually might support our planet, might support our species. Like, tell us about Another Now, and and give us a teaser at least, because I mean, I think we're all really looking for that vision, that utopia. Name of the podcast.
yeah. Look, Another Now is due to my partner, my wife, than I, who at some point she was exasperated with me. She said, "Look, got to tell the world and me, her, how things could be different today. Today, not in 2200, but today. How could things be different without capitalist relations of production? Could we have a socialism worth fighting for today, given the fallibility of human nature and the level of technological development that we have? Not Star Trek, where you have replicators and therefore you don't
Right.
need any work. So human labor is gone. This is unnecessary. No, today, when human labor is still necessary, how could it work? And so I thought, okay, well, if I sit down and I write a kind of utopia book, here is how things could be today, I would be bored even before I started writing it. Because for me, what is important, what matters is, firstly, not only to describe how the world could be, but also how it got there, the transition, the theory of change. So I looked back at the 2008 moment, which, as our audience has witnessed today, I keep referring to as a pivotal moment, a pivotal rupture in the history of the world. And remember Occupy Wall Street, Occupy the City of London, the Indignados movement in Spain, the Anarchismeni movement here in Greece. There was an interesting eruption of anti-systemic optimism and hope. But of course, we were dumb. And the way we carried out, with Occupy Wall Street, I mean, we spent 5 hours deciding amongst ourselves whether we should be selling Coca-Cola, at the stall. Wall Street bankers were laughing at us. They knew that wasn't going to end well for us. So what could we have done differently? How could we have overthrown capitalism and replaced it with a pure, a real democratic alternative with democratized corporations, with a democratized system of allocating land and buildings and real estate instead of the real estate sector that we now have? How could we democratize money? What would we do with the Federal Reserve? What about the banks? Where would you save your money? How would corporations work if they were run on the basis of one person, one vote? So I decided I have to write this. How could we have done things differently? But of course, that meant I would have to create an alternative timeline from 2008 to now. So I sat down and, because of my Star Trek and science background, I created, a few characters. By the way, the other thing was that because when we talk about democratic socialism in the future, sometimes I disagree with myself about how it should work. Because when it comes to explaining the current reality, I think a lot about it, and then I can produce you an essay or a book where I can tell you what I think about what's happening now. But how should the world work tomorrow? This is something which brings in me contradictory views. So I decided, okay, so I need to do two things. Firstly, create a new timeline from 2008 to today, explaining how things could have been different. This is a very powerful slogan. Everything could be different. David Graeber, right?
Yeah.
And secondly, how can I accommodate my own conflicting views about how socialism should work? So I thought the only way I can accommodate conflicting views of how socialism should work is to have characters in my book debating with one another. Well, that's the makings of a novel. So I
Beautiful.
had three main characters. So I
Hmm.
had uh, Eva, who is a neoliberal former Lehman Brothers financial engineer, who, of course, has crashed and burned in 2008, and now she has an existentialist crisis. But she's still a neoliberal professor of economics, poisoning the mind of the young in her lectures with
I feel like
neoliberal.
I've met her.
So Eva, yeah, I have known so many Evas. I worked with them in universities, right? Then there is Costa, who is a brilliant tech engineer. He's involved in Neuralink-like organizations and big tech and so on. And he's a Greek. That's where I come in, but it's based on a real person, a friend of mine,
Ah,
who is an engineer and now works in Silicon Valley. But he's a Marxist and a rebel deep down, and he always rejects the power of big tech, even though he works for big tech. So that's the second character. And then there is Iris, who is modeled on a number of people I've known in my life. She's a Marxist feminist who loathes Marxists and feminists. Who is
I think I know exactly what you're talking
yeah.
about.
And what happens in my book? I'll just say that, and that will be it. One of Costas's experiments. This is happening in 2025, 2035. During that period. One of his experiments with one of his machines goes wrong, and he finds a tiny wormhole emerges, which connects him to an alternative timeline which started 2008, where he can talk to himself in that
Wow.
timeline. The socialist revolution took place. So there is a dialogue between these three characters and their counterparts in the alternative timeline, where they're exchanging notes. And the people on that timeline can't believe that we still have capitalist relations of production, and we allowed techno-feudal lords to take over. And our people here cannot believe that there was a successful socialism over there. And they discuss, they exchange notes. And then, of course, there is a dramatic culmination, which I'm not going to talk about.
Good. We have to leave people with the without that punchline there. But I also just want to ask you really quick with Star Trek, your love of Star Trek, and maybe we can all pay attention to Star Trek a little bit now as we sort of think about what another now could look like. Like,
Let me
tell
give
us
you, let
just
me
a
give you
little
a
bit about
very,
that. Where should we start? Where do you draw your inspiration from that? And
well, firstly, it's a depiction of libertarian communism and pacifism and anti-imperialism. Think about it. The
yeah.
very primary directive, which is what? We do not interfere with other cultures.
Yep.
It's the exact opposite of imperialism. Secondly, there is there is no private ownership, there is no money, and all labor is produced by machines that are owned collectively. That's
Mm,
communism. That's
mm,
libertarian communism.
mm.
But allow me to mention one episode. I can't remember exactly which one it was. It's from the Next Generation with Captain Picard. Enterprise is the USS Enterprise is exploring the universe, and at some point they chance upon a rusty old Earth created manufactured spaceship, which is empty except for these bots, where rich people from the 1980s, through cryogenics, have frozen themselves after death, and they paid a lot of money for the company that sort of took them out to space in case aliens can find them and to revive them. This is the transhumanism. This is
Wow. It's
Elon.
literally what people are babbling
Yeah.
about now. Yeah.
So Enterprise finds them and they bring them in and they thaw them and cure them because all of them died because of heart attacks, cancer, whatever. But now they have the technology. The doctor of the Enterprise has the technology to fix all that and thaw them. And now they wake up. So there is this remarkable conversation between one of them, who is a financier from Wall Street, and Captain Picard, because this guy is recalcitrant. He's obnoxious, of course, right?
Yeah.
Financier from Wall Street, and he demands to see the captain. And the captain is, of course, busy with his whatever. Anyway, the captain sees him at the end and says, I demand to be allowed to make contact with Earth. I need to talk to my lawyer because I want to check my portfolio. It must be huge by now. And the guy says, look, I don't want to disappoint you. This is, we are in another era. We have overcome the teething troubles of humanity. He said, what do you mean teething troubles of humanity? He said, well, money and accumulation, and, the possessive individualism. And he says, what do you mean? Anyway, he understands that there's no stock exchange, there are no shares because you have common ownership of the means of production and the machines do all the work. And Picard says to him that you have to understand that money is no longer something to aspire to because we have other ways of fulfilling ourselves. And the guy says to him, but you really misunderstand the past. It was never about money. It was about power. Mm-hmm. And surely your society must also suffer from the same thing. Well, and so there is a beautiful political economy discussion there. And even the obnoxious financier has a point. He says, am I not alive? Why am I alive? Because of the power that I managed to extract from all the other minions on Earth, which allowed me to be here talking to you. So there is this amazing conversation. There's another episode in Voyager with another captain, a female captain, which for me is the best. If you want to teach students who have heard nothing about Karl Marx and historical materialism, you want to teach historical materialism in 45 minutes, you show that episode. It's called Blink of an Eye.
Okay, Blink of an Eye on Voyager.
So Voyager approaches a planet, which is a very strange planet because it spins very fast, and the time dimension on the planet's surface is much faster than it is in orbit. So essentially, and the Voyager is caught in the gravitational field of this crazy planet, and because time moves much faster on the surface than it does in Voyager, they can actually observe the evolution of a species there, of a humanoid species, and they can see that the species can see the spaceship as a star in the sky, and they start worshiping it. The star that pointed out the birth of Jesus and so on. And you can see I'll cut a long story short. You can see the evolution of this society as it relates to the starship and the manner in which it goes through an agrarian revolution, then an industrial revolution, then nuclear wars between them. And you can see the whole thing, how prejudice turns into religion, how religion then becomes ideology, how a Cold War begins and a hot war, a thermonuclear war begins, and how in the end they overcome all this with technology. And then they manage to emerge from the planet and actually save Voyager from being captured in the gravitational field of this planet. So you see the whole point about the way in which technology emerges. It creates a lot of poverty, a lot of war, a lot of damage, but at the same time progress, and how the human spirit manages to reach a socialist level whereby they liberate themselves from both prejudice and class conflict.
Wow, that's beautiful. Beautiful. I mean, we're gonna leave people with that, and here's to overcoming the teething problems of humanity. Well, here's Indeed. To overcoming it. My deepest gratitude, Yanis. The great Yanis Varoufakis, thank you. I appreciate you very much. Thank you for joining Utopia. I appreciate you. I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know. And feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions,
on guests, reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support.